Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I just wanted to post a lecture giving some overview of late medieval literature. We've actually just finished reading Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which is a late product of late medieval literature that is late 14th century, after what's known as the Great Vowel Shift, which you probably haven't heard of, but actually has had a major impact on English as it's spoken today, and it accounts for much of the reason why the language of Geoffrey Chaucer, who we're about to read in this class, is much more familiar to modern English and to speakers now than, for instance, Beowulf, which emerged from Old English, and it's literally classified as a separate language. So we're now in England in the late 14th century when Geoffrey Chaucer, who some would call the father of modern English literature. I mean, we have Shakespeare, who people are very familiar with. Chaucer came before Shakespeare and actually wrote about a lot of the same things, including Troilus and Cressida. Both of them actually drew on a lot of similar sources. And so we might have some problem with the whole idea of fatherhood and the patriarchal lineage that sets up. However, it is true that Geoffrey Chaucer is the first, we've been reading these texts in this class by by unknown anonymous authors. And so finally we have a name and a somewhat of a face to put to the poems that we're reading. And so this is finally there's the second last point on the slide. We have vernacular commercial book production, which was drastically expanded during this period of time. So while we don't yet have the printing press, which is 1500, we have scribes and illustrators kind of set up in urban centers, copying books and being paid to copy books outside of churches, which means that more ideas are getting into the hands of more people than ever, and there's literacy spreading. So some people think of medieval culture as divided into three social estates: nobility, that is the aristocracy; clergy, that is religious people and priests and monks and nuns; and the peasantry, which is sort of everyone else, all of secular society. Of course, it is a lot more complicated but it is true that many peasants were not able to read. And now that we had vernacular commercial book production, so vernacular just means the language that's spoken rather than the language that's written. And you can imagine, even thinking to your own background, if you speak if English isn't your first language, and you might speak at home or think in a different language, and if what you're reading and writing in school is in a different language, that's going to be very alienating for you. So it's very significant that at this time, we have the Anglo-Normans, who are sort of French invaders since 1066, who took over the courts. And so a lot of things are being written in French. A lot of things were still being written in Latin in the courts and in the legal system. And now finally we have things being circulated in English. So this was very significant for people. And along with the expansion of commercial book production is we have names starting to be associated with authors. And so Geoffrey Chaucer himself began to gain some fame and some notoriety, even though he himself was not a nobleman. He rolled with the court a little bit, and was kind of one of the first people to become quite famous due to his poetry. So that's what we're about to read, The Wife of Bath's Tale. I'm just going to play this 6-minute video to give you some background on just how manuscripts at this time were made. And if you want to skip ahead to hear more about Geoffrey Chaucer, you can do that, but I think this is worthwhile.
In the Middle Ages, parchment was used to make the pages of books. Parchment was made from the skins of animals. The transition from a fresh skin to a surface suitable for writing was a slow and laborious process. The parchment maker selected skins of sheep, goats, or calves. Skins were soaked in lime water for 3 to 10 days to loosen the animal's hair. The parchment maker then scraped away the hair and any remaining flesh. After this, the skin was soaked in fresh water to remove the lime and then stretched tightly on a frame. A special rounded knife was used to scrape the hide to the desired thickness. The process of scraping continued over the course of several days. During this time, the parchment maker continually tightened the tension on the stretching frame while the skin dried. The result was parchment, a smooth and durable material that could last over 1,000 years. Before parchment could be written on, it had to be specially prepared. First, the parchment was rubbed with pumice powder to roughen the surface, and then dusted with a sticky powder. These steps made the surface receptive to inks and colors. The whole finished skin was then cut down to the size of the pages needed for a particular book. A big manuscript was assembled from sheets almost as large as a single skin. For smaller books, the skin was cut into 2 or more pieces. The parchment sheets were folded and nested to make gatherings, usually of 16 or 20 pages. The vibrant illuminations in a medieval manuscript often overshadow the words on the page, yet the writing of the script was as important as the painting of the images. The tools of a scribe, the person who copied the text onto the page, were simple. Pens, called quills, were made from the feathers of a bird, which were soaked in water, dried, and hardened with heated sand. The scribe carved the quill to a rough point, cut a slit to draw ink down, then trimmed the point to the proper width. The shape of the quill point varied with the style of the lettering being copied. Scribes made ink from a variety of materials. Gallnuts, growths found on oak trees, were often used to create a dark black ink. Black ink was also made by dissolving a common carbon substance. The resulting ink was called lamp black. Before the scribe began writing, he ruled the parchment using a straight edge. Medieval scribes and their patrons prized a regular and elegant script. If a scribe made an error, he would scratch it out with a penknife. Because the page was made from parchment, which was very resilient, it could stand many erasures of this type. An illuminator decorated the pages of a manuscript using paint and precious metals. He began only after a scribe had finished copying the text. The illuminator first sketched his design, then added details, such as the features of a figure or the interlacing of a decorated initial. Thin sheets of precious metals, like gold leaf, were always applied first. The illuminator put down a base coat, consisting of either a plaster-like substance called gesso or a gum, as shown here. Once the gum base dried, the moisture in the illuminator's breath was enough to make the small piece of gold leaf stick to the page. Then the illuminator brushed away the excess and polished the gold leaf. After applying the gold leaf, the illuminator painted his design. Each color was made from a vegetable dye or a mineral substance ground up and dissolved in liquid. The illuminator applied the paler shades first, then the darker tones. Once the illuminator applied black outlines and delicate white highlights to the figures and vines, the illumination was finished. After the scribes and illuminators had finished writing and decorating the parchment pages, the manuscript was bound. Groups of folded sheets of parchment, called gatherings, were sewn together with strong linen thread onto flexible supports, such as these narrow leather thongs. Next, the binder attached end bands, which secured the top and bottom ends of the pages in the spine of the book. The binder then laced the leather thongs along the spine through channels and tunnels, which had been carved into wood boards. These boards were the covers of the manuscript. The thongs could be held in place by wood pegs or iron nails. The volume was then covered, usually with leather. Without pressure from the covers to keep the leaves flat, parchment expanded and contracted with changes in temperature and humidity. Pressure was applied by the addition of clasps or straps, which held the book closed. The binding of a manuscript could be decorated with any one of a variety of materials. A manuscript might be covered with leather, stamped or tooled with gold, or covered with silks or velvets. The most elaborate bindings received sculpted decoration made from precious metals. The materials of the binding depended on the wealth of the patron, the type of manuscript, and its intended use.
All right. So that's probably more information than you need, but that's okay. I don't know why this isn't in present mode anymore. Yeah, I mean, I know it's more information than you need, but I find it very relaxing to watch how that, especially in our digital age, like how much care and attention and time and expense was put into that process. Although I cut out, I know we talked briefly in class about like also how many animals were needed to create these books. And so that part I think was not so calm and relaxing. It's kind of quite gruesome to have hundreds of animals slaughtered just for like a couple church books. However, I do think that at this period in time with the expansion of commercial book production, we also had paper being used more and more. And Chaucer, so the last couple texts that we read, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and Beowulf, both only survived to us in one single manuscript. And both of those manuscripts were housed by Robert Cotton. So they're in the Cotton Library in in the British Library in London, and they survived a fire. And it's very, it's a miracle that they survived to us at all. Whereas Chaucer, especially the Canterbury Tales, which is what he's the best known for, I think it's about 80 manuscripts that we have. So you can already see that it's just like exponentially larger. So Chaucer himself, we don't know a ton about him. So much like Shakespeare, he's a bit of a mystery, but we do know that he did a lot of stuff, that he was a man of all trades. He worked a range of jobs throughout his life. He was actually a page. He was a page in the court. He was in charge of customs for a while. He kind of surveyed architectural projects. He traveled around. I mean, he must have been quite well to do because not many people would get to travel, but we kind of know that he traveled both to France and to Italy, and so then was influenced by the poetry and literature being produced there, by the likes of such people like Boccaccio and Petrarch. So he sort of brought those qualities back and then pumped them into English, which, as I said, or as we've been talking about a little bit, English was not the most prestigious language. And so in a way, he's contributing to these efforts to make it kind of operate on the same level as French or Italian. He was a soldier for a while. He fought in the 100 Years' War. And he was married with probably 3 children. I'm also going to say here, I should have a slide about this actually. And this is, an uncomfortable aspect of his life, that there is evidence to suggest that he actually was a rapist as well. And I'm sorry, that's we're going to talk about that because we have to, because we're going to be reading The Wife of Bath's Tale. But basically, there's a court record that survives from someone, Cecily of Champagne, who is retracting her charge of raptus against Chaucer. And so raptus is a Latin word, raptus, at the time that can mean either rape or abduction. I mean, in a way, you can see the sort of connections between them, and we can certainly talk in class about the associations that women, if you think of women as property, stealing their bodies or stealing them away, like these things were all kind of interrelated at the time. And so we don't really know anything about the case beyond just that one document where this poor woman, Cecily, is saying like, okay, I rescind the charges. But as you can imagine, there's been a lot of speculation, especially if we've just talked about Chaucer as the father of English literature. What does it mean when one of the fathers of English literature is potentially someone who raped someone else and then was exonerated for it and still got to benefit from all the fame and all the notoriety of being at court around London, as opposed to the Gawain author or poet who was, as we talked about, situated further away from the courtly center in the north. And especially given the Me Too movement, I'd be very curious to hear your thoughts about that as well. But we still study him. And he wrote a lot of poetry. He wrote He translated a really famous French poem called Romance of the Rose, kind of a French bestseller, and he translated much of it into English. He wrote a number of dream visions that I love and I study, and that was sort of in his early days as a poet. But the thing that he's most, I mean, if you can already see here, he died, he wasn't a super old man, but he started the Canterbury Tales kind of in the 1380s. And so later in his career, and it's quite clear that he never finished. So the basic premise of the Canterbury Tales is that you have a group of people, 20 some pilgrims, who are all gathered together, and they meet at a pub, and it turns out they're all going to this beautiful cathedral that still exists today called Canterbury Cathedral on a pilgrimage. And at the time you go on a pilgrimage, you gain blessings from the church, you get your indulgences, and so you actually win a few more points in heaven or whatever once you get to the shrine. So Canterbury, which I have a picture right here of the amazing, breathtaking Canterbury Cathedral. If you're ever in England, it's a must see. This is just the outside. I think you can find pictures of the interior online as well. And you can actually see there's a little bit of scaffolding in this picture. But this is where they're headed. And it's about, I just decided to Google it because I was curious how far it takes to walk from London to Canterbury. I mean, so I guess some of them are on horses. But if you walked, it would be about 20 hours. So it's 60 miles. Nothing to sneeze at. And so they're all the scheme of the Canterbury Tales as laid out in the general prologue. They all meet at this pub, and then they decide it's a really long walk, a real long journey, and so they need to tell stories to pass the time. It's a massive project. So you have a number, and the general prologue gives like a short description of each pilgrim, some of whom actually don't end up telling a tale. So one wonders if Chaucer had tales in mind for those people, or if he's just kind of, the really remarkable thing about this text is that he's giving like a snapshot of all humanity and all different social classes. Chaucer has a very characteristically satiric, kind of ironic slant. So a lot of people find, myself included, find Chaucer's poetry to be very funny. There are fart jokes, there are sex jokes, there are all of the things that kind of still delight us today. And that's why I think it's such a pleasure to read. And he just seems to have such a very adept glimpse and understanding of how humanity works, even if it's a little bit underhanded, or cynical. So the original plan was for about 120 stories, in fact, each pilgrim was supposed to tell 2 stories, 2 on the way to Canterbury and 2 on the way back. All we have is that there are 22 stories and the beginnings of 2 others. So it seems to be an unfinished project, something that, would take 50 years to complete, and he probably died. We've actually had people post-Chaucerian our poets tried to finish the Canterbury Tales. It's sort of interesting to look into that tradition, because you still kind of have this sense, it's like fan fiction, like people kind of writing back or extending some of the text. And we talked about that previously in terms of anonymity and poems that would circulate in an oral culture, and how like readers and listeners, well, especially listeners who weren't able to read, but were able to hear and to absorb and then retell and maybe add in their own creative details. So listening itself was sort of a creative process. And so even though now we have Chaucer's name attached to the Canterbury Tales and his poetry, you have poets in post-Chaucerian poets kind of trying to extend and adapt the Canterbury Tales to their own ends, even though we also have a lot of poems that are, because Chaucer became so famous, for like the next 100 years, you'd have a bunch of poems that were said to be written by Chaucer, but actually weren't written by Chaucer. So people were kind of like, hey, buy my book, it's a bunch of Chaucer that you've never read. But we actually don't think that a lot of these poems are actually written by Chaucer. So you have to do extensive, analysis lexical analysis to kind of argue one way or the other. But as I said, the Canterbury Tales, and this is just an image from one of the surviving books, I believe the Huntington Canterbury Tales, and this is, I suppose that's supposed to be him. I mean, he's kind of along for the ride, although it's the host, Harry Bailey, who is running things and who's going to give out a prize at the end of the four tales each, you know, an insane number of stories, and one of them is going to win like a free meal at his inn. You know, it's not a major prize. It's clearly more about the process than about the product. But I think you can look through the general prologue and think about Chaucer's own understanding of human nature and the different people presented in the prologue. So the prologue is where they're all described. We're only going to be reading like the snapshot of Wife of Bath from the prologue because she's the only one we're reading from the Canterbury Tales and her story, both her prologue and her tales. So you have, I know this is confusing. And again, you know, maybe I should have had a slide laying this out again, but you have the general prologue of the Canterbury Tales, which is just like, here are each of the people who are on the pilgrimage. And so, and we have just basically the descriptions of them. And the beginning of the general prologue is very famous. When that April with his shortish sorte, the draught of March hath pierced to the rota, and bathed every vein in sweet liqueur, of which vertu engendered is the fleur. So it's taking place in spring as things are melting, and birds are singing, fowls are making melody, and you have flowers, and there's kind of this sense of new beginnings. And then the description of each of the pilgrims happens in the general prologue. And then each of them tells their own prologue. So you have the host who's kind of running the show and saying like, okay, you go now, then you go, then you go. And then each of them introduces their own tale and then tells the tale. So it's a very extensive kind of situation here. So I'm actually not going to go through this particular slide. It kind of goes through some of what I've already said. You can look up what a state satire is. And here's the description of the Wife of Bath from the general prologue. I was going to read this, but I actually have to go right now. So you'll have to kind of read it on your own. And I really look forward to talking with you all on Friday.